Good afternoon. I think we will go ahead and get started. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Megan Moreno, who is an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Adolescent Medicine at the University of Washington and a researcher at the Center for Child Health, Behavior, and Development at Seattle Children's Research Institute. Dr. Moreno was a political science major at Northwestern University. She attended locally at George Washington University Med School, followed by pediatrics residency at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where she did a pediatric residency and then served as the chief resident and stayed on to get a master's of science in education. And because that was not enough school, she then went on to get a fellowship in adolescent medicine and sexually transmitted diseases and HIV research, while obtaining her M.P.H at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is board certified in pediatrics and adolescent medicine, and as you can read, her research focuses on ways in which technology can be used towards investigating and improving adolescent health with particular interests in social media. She's the principal investigator of the Social Media and Adolescent Health Research Team, or SMART, whose staff and students include an interdisciplinary team. She has received funding from several NIH institutes, and Dr. Moreno's team is currently conducting a NIDA-sponsored longitudinal multi-site study of college students using social media as a mechanism of behavior change for substance use. She is known nationally and internationally for this expertise, and she's received several teaching and pediatric research awards. Her book, Sex, Drugs, and Facebook, was published in October 2013 and translates her findings into helpful tips and guidelines for parents and adults towards promoting safe internet use. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Moreno.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's truly an honor to be here and be able to talk about the journey of research that my team and I have taken on in the last 5-7 years and some of what we've learned. I'd like to begin by introducing my team, the Social Media and Adolescent Health Research Team, and tell you a little bit about what we do. We view ourselves as having the mission of advancing society's understanding of the relationship between media and adolescent health towards educating adolescents and their families, towards providing better care for teens, and most importantly, towards developing innovations in adolescent health care. Our values include an interdisciplinary approach with emphasis on using ethical and sound research practices. We have a strong training mission, and our trainees go all the way from undergraduates through postdocs, and within the medical training system, it includes fellows, residents, medical students. We have trainees with diverse backgrounds: public health, education, communication, marketing, sociology. Our newest acquisition is forensic science, so she's promised to teach me how to blow up cars, as well as me teaching her how to code Facebook. Our values include partnering with other researchers, educators, clinicians, and community members in both the development of our projects, as well as in the translation of what we learn from those projects. And we value a diverse and collaborative research team. Our work really centers on 3 areas, as you see here, and our vision is to provide education to adolescents and their families towards safe internet use, which is represented by the Internet Safety Core. We also focus on developing tools to assess and define internet use and problematic internet use, which is represented by our measuring technology use and misuse core, as well as to both create and interpret messages within social media. And it's that core that I'll spend my time on discussing with you today. For our talk, I'd like to begin with a couple key issues related to adolescent health that have really helped drive a lot of the work we've done. I'd like to introduce a few key concepts from the social media landscape of today, and then I'd like to spend the majority of our time talking about 4 areas of research in which we've found that social media can really enhance our understanding of adolescent health. To begin with thinking through adolescent health, I'll place this slide up here, and a version of this slide was initially shown to me when I was in medical school. And the lecturer who presented it told us that this slide represented the 3 major causes of morbidity and mortality for the adolescent population. Some of you have probably seen slides similar to this. Accidents, motor vehicle accidents most common, homicide, and suicide. So while I was in the midst in medical school of learning the Krebs cycle and looking at pancreatic islet cells under a microscope, what I see in my clinical practice today is that these are the things that are really the major causes of morbidity and mortality for my population, which is still striking to me when I think about it. We're very fortunate that decades of research have illustrated to us that there are many risk factors, many precursor behaviors, many red flags that an adolescent will show us that can illustrate that they may be at risk for those causes of morbidity and mortality. And that's behaviors such as substance use, risky sexual behaviors, and comorbidities such as depression. So there should be a lot of ways that we can identify these adolescents at risk to try to prevent those causes of morbidity and mortality. But there's a couple challenges when it comes to adolescents, only a couple, of course, right? And one of them is that they don't go to the doctor. Adolescents are one of our healthiest populations. They don't often seek care at the doctor, and particularly if they're worried about their confidentiality, they won't always seek care for a problem that they might be having. And when adolescents do show up at the doctor, many are not screened about these risks that are associated with morbidity and mortality. So in some studies have shown that less than half of teens are screened for substance use or depression when seeing a pediatrician. And so these are the fundamentals that really drove me to be interested in social media, to ask the question of whether social media could offer new opportunities for early identification of risk behaviors or risky health behaviors, early opportunities for prevention or for intervention. So what is the social media landscape today? Many of you have heard about social media at some point in the last 5 years, and I think there's a few key concepts to think about for today. One is that social media is interactive media. It is media in which you as a user can create content as well as consume content. And as my teenage patients would say, you can talk as well as listen. And I think the best way to understand what is meant by interactive media is to compare social media to what I would call older forms of media, or as my patients would say, vintage media. So in these forms of media, television, music, movies, what you see is a corporation or a company that creates a message and delivers it to you as a consumer. So you as a consumer have a choice. You can turn on the TV, you can change the channel, but you don't have a choice in being able to give feedback in a way that's meaningful. You aren't able to participate in the creation of that media. And that's wildly different than the world of social media today, where there's a plethora of sites, a plethora of different types of platforms, but the thing they share in common is the opportunity for you as a user to create as well as consume that media. And that's really important when you think about adolescence. Social media is wildly popular. Estimates are over 90% of adolescents are using social media. And what's even perhaps more striking is the adoption of social media by adults. I tend to think the first revolution of social media was when it came out and young adults and adolescents jumped on board immediately and quickly. But really the second, the quiet revolution, is all of us as adults who have joined as well and have made that conversation on social media very different. The most popular sites at a global level are still Facebook and Twitter. But what's interesting now is that multiple platforms are the norm. It's no longer a matter of, oh my gosh, is Facebook most popular, or is Twitter most popular, or is this one fading, or is that one fading? It's really a case of, does that adolescent use Facebook or Twitter? It's both and rather than either or. So multiple platforms are the norm. Adolescents are using different platforms in different ways, and each have their own niche sites that are their favorites. Another thing about social media is it's really pervasive throughout our society. You see it when adolescents or adults are at the bus stop and checking their phones. They can access from home, they can access from public libraries. And what I love about this picture, which we obtained permission from, I saw this and just had to get a picture, and this lovely young man gave me permission, is he's on one phone and checking something on another. It's everywhere, and you really can't escape it anymore. Social media is also thought to be a very persuasive form of media, and B.J. Fogg at Stanford said that social media has ushered in a new era of persuasion called mass interpersonal persuasion, and he argues that social media is the biggest revolution in persuasion since radio was invented. But I think another interesting piece about social media is it takes images and thoughts and feelings that used to be personal, and it makes them very public. And I think this is a nice transition to thinking about one of our first areas of research, which is observational research. So today we'll talk through observation, association, influence, and intervention. But we'll start with thinking about what kinds of observational studies might be possible on social media, keeping in mind those sources of morbidity and mortality that are affecting our adolescent population. There's several areas in which you can conduct observation. One is thinking about health behaviors and risk behavior research, risk behavior displays across sites. You can think about an individual user and what are their display patterns over time. You can think about those displays within the peer group context. Social media is a socially constructed media, and so looking just at an individual may not give you the whole picture of what the context is of their displays. And we can also understand trends and new thoughts at the population level. So first, thinking about health and risk behavior displays, one of our earliest studies was on MySpace. And on this study, what we did is we selected 500 profiles randomly. This was in the era in which most MySpace profiles were public. We only had to exclude about 10% of profiles that were set to private back then. And so we examined 500 profiles with 1 year of content. And they were 18-year-olds, or said they were 18-year-olds on MySpace. And what we were interested in is what sort of clues do they give us about those precursors to morbidity, mortality, substance use, sexual behavior, aggression, and violence. And what we found is across that sample of 500, about 41% displayed references to substance use. And the vast majority were alcohol. About 37% of profiles had one or more references to alcohol use, lesser numbers for tobacco and drugs. About a quarter of the profiles displayed one or more references to sexual behavior, and about 14% to violence. And similar to offline survey research that is shown when adolescents engage in one behavior, risk behavior, they're more likely to engage in another. What we found is that adolescents who displayed one type of risk behavior on MySpace were more likely to display others. And so across our sample, about 54% of the profiles displayed one or more health risk behaviors. So when Facebook came along, we did another pilot study to see whether we would find similar types of displays related to health risk behavior. And the most striking difference you might notice already is that substance use displays on profiles jumps up to about 76%. And the vast majority of that is alcohol displays. So early on, that gave us a sense Facebook is a different venue. There's a different culture. This is a different population that's hanging out here. What you might notice, too, is that the proportion of profiles in which the profile owner displayed references to drugs also goes up. But it's interesting to note that what accounts for that is actually hookah, which at the time we were categorizing in the substance use category. We could probably debate that quite a bit, whether it should go in substance use or tobacco, but hookah is very prevalent on Facebook. And then the prevalence of references to sexual behaviors was similar. So what do I mean by a reference to health risk behavior? Let's talk about text references. Social media is multimedia. Here are examples of health risk behaviors and text-based references. I'm glad that you all can see it, and it's nice and big on the screen, so I don't have to read it and feel embarrassed. So sometimes I'm asked the question of whether there's a lot of gray zone in the areas in which we work. And I often respond that adolescents are very savvy with telling us about what they're doing and what's important to them. And I think a lot of these references really illustrate that. So these would be maybe a status update or a text-based message. I think what's also interesting to me is that we can get more nuanced. And what I'm really interested in is not necessarily alcohol behaviors only, but really in understanding and defining problematic alcohol behaviors. And I think this status update really gets at some of what we're most interested in is here's a really dangerous behavior of driving while drinking. And this is a common type of status update that really gets our attention, and it's not a rare one on Facebook. We also know that Facebook includes, and most other social media sites also include images. So images might include memes, which are very popular right now. In the past, downloaded icons were more popular. MySpace had a lot of glitter on it. So while the image types change over time, the importance of adolescents in decorating their profiles with images stays relatively the same. And most of what you can see that adolescents are decorating their profiles with is either humorous or supportive ideas around overconsumption or around substance use. The eye hookah here is one of my favorites. We also see that adolescents take advantage of the multimedia aspects of social media to show us photos of themselves. So we often see that photos of routine alcohol use, going out with a group of friends, a book club with a glass of wine, that's not really what adolescents are showing us. A lot of times what they're showing us is suggestions of overconsumption. So drinking straight from a pitcher, 2 large bottles, kind of the overconsumption is often what's being displayed. So in addition to being able to get a sense of displays of particular health behaviors on particular sites, we can also think about an individual participant and what they choose to display over time. And the example study I'd like to highlight here is one we did called Feeling Bad on Facebook. And in this study, we evaluated displayed depression symptom references on Facebook over 1 year among college students, and we defined a displayed depression symptom as a text disclosure that was consistent with DSM criteria. So what I mean by this is, along this side, you see we have different depression symptom criteria that are included in the DSM. We develop a library of synonyms and of keywords that would represent those symptoms. And then we also develop key phrases that would not be included. And so that is the criteria we apply to determining whether a text reference meets criteria as a depression symptom reference. So in this study, I'm going to show you the results in which we took a look at the profiles, and we identified profiles that had a 2-week time period in the past year in which they displayed 5 of 9 depression symptoms in that 2-week period. My hypothesis was that we would not find any of these, but we actually found 5 out of a total sample of 200. So a very small number, only 2.5%, but these are profiles in which they chose to display depression symptom references in a 2-week period. So you can learn a lot from looking at these patterns. Along this side of the graph, we have time. Along this side, we have our 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 participants. And along this side of the graph, we have the total number of depression symptom references that month on Facebook. So if you look at participant 1, they have 1 reference in July, nothing in August, 2 in September, a handful in October, back down in November, nothing December, and another 1 in January. If we look in contrast at participant 5, there's no references up until the very end of the study, where we see large numbers escalating in time. And what's interesting to me with this is that this really mirrors a lot of what we often see in the clinical arena, where our patients with depression come in and their depression symptoms are waxing and waning over time. And so it was interesting to us to be able to see that pattern on Facebook. This doesn't mean that Facebook is any way diagnostic or that we can apply diagnostic tools, but it gives us a sense of the experience of these adolescents and what they're willing to reveal to us about how they're feeling. I think another way we can observe is thinking about these displays within peer groups, either in the response of their peers to the displays, as well as thinking more about the groups in which they're situated by social network analysis. In one of our studies, the one that I mentioned, Feeling Bad on Facebook, another piece that we examined was peer response to depression disclosures. So this young lady is 18, and she discloses, feeling so bad today, like nothing is going to get better. And the responses from peers are, hang in there, baby, it will get better, I promise, want to get coffee tomorrow. And I think what's salient about this is they're offering online support, but they're also offering gestures to go meet offline. And this one's my favorite, a 19-year-old male who says, like a knife to my heart, like a bullet to the chest, can't stop crying. And the response is, I'm coming over and I'm bringing the Xbox, which I think is the best therapy that someone could offer this guy. In-person peer response, coming over right now. So I think it's really important to understand these displays in the context of how people are responding to them. Another way to think about displays within peer groups is to think about who is the audience that this person has chosen to surround themselves with on social media. And this was a study led by one of our team members who's a sociologist, Alina Arsenev, and she wanted to look at pro-eating disorder social interaction on Twitter. And what she did was she identified 45 pro-eating disorder Twitter accounts as egos. So how do we define this as a pro-eating disorder Twitter account? The username was consistent with being pro-eating disorder. The content was related to being pro-eating disorder. An example would be this handle name, Sexy Anorexy. So we analyzed their content, and then we looked at their followers to see how many of their followers are also displaying content that's pro-ED in nature. And what we found was these pro-ED profiles had a median of 173 followers, so no Lady Gaga with 50 million, but these are adolescents. How do they know 173 people on Twitter to follow? And about 44% of their followers also had ED references within their profiles. So almost half of their followers were also displaying pro-ED content. So since this is a Twitter study, I sort of can't help the pun that it suggested to us that birds of a feather may be flocking together and reinforcing some of these behaviors that might not be healthy to these participants. So if we then think about displays at the population level, we were really interested in Washington State in what was going to happen with the legislation in 2012 that legalized recreational marijuana use for adults over age 21, or I should say older adolescents over age 21. And the social movement and the debate about marijuana legalization was very prominent on social media, and we were really interested in what kind of communication there was around that debate. And so we chose to look at YouTube for this study because what we were hearing anecdotally is that a lot of people were using YouTube to view videos that either argued pro or con, and then would look at the comments to get a feeling of what people's response to the videos was. So we selected 50 videos, a mix of being pro-legalization, against legalization, and neutral, and we analyzed 892 comments. And this study was led by one of our undergraduate researchers, Annie Yee. 892 comments. So let me show you a little bit about what we found. One thing we did with the comments is we put them into categories by what subject the comment was addressing. So here you see political gets at political differences that may be driving or not driving legalization, the dangers of legalization. One interesting category was comparison. A lot of the comments were comparing marijuana to another substance, and the most common comparisons were alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. So making the case that it's similar to other substances that are legal. But I think the big take-home points are that 88% of all comments were positive towards marijuana legalization. And this category here, attack on opinion, was a very common category, 20% of the comments. And 91% of these attacks on opinion were directed towards other comments that either had negative or questioning views towards marijuana. And so I think it's important to realize that social media provides this open access, but not everybody's showing up to the ball field to play. And so it's really important to realize that the information that our adolescents might be seeking about some of these major social movements or health issues may be biased. So another way to think about displays at the population level is being able to use social media as a lens through which to compare two different populations. And that's something that we did in this study, emergence of alcohol displays on first-year college students' Facebook profiles from 2 universities. So in this study, we recruited entering college students from a school in the Midwest, a school in the Pacific Northwest, both state schools, both about the same size. There wasn't a lot of reason to think that there would be a lot of difference. And we evaluated their Facebook profiles monthly to detect the first time they chose to display about alcohol. And coming into the study, only about 20% of our participants displayed references to alcohol on Facebook prior to arriving at college. So what we found is over that first year of watching their profiles, another 40% chose to display a first reference to alcohol. And there were some differences in the two populations. So here we have the straight dark line is University A, which is our Midwestern university, and the dotted red line is University B, our Northwestern university. Across here is time. And what you see is this first spike in display of first alcohol references at our Midwestern university right around Halloween. And it turns out that that coincides with a campus-based Halloween party that is supposed to be for 21 and over only and has a large alcohol component to the study. So this was really interesting data to us because the campus had made a lot of efforts to crack down on making that party only for people who were of age, but our data suggested that perhaps that was not necessarily being adhered to. Another big spike that goes off the charts is a party called Mifflin Street Block Party that takes place at the university where we studied it, and that was another large alcohol-themed party that the university had been really trying to crack down on. And so we could really see these differences in how campus activities, how events were really affecting when these first-year college students were willing to start displaying about alcohol. So that study was in the context of our current work. We're doing a study called Using Media to Investigate Mechanisms of Behavior Change Among College Students. It's a longitudinal study funded under the Science of Behavior Change RFA. And we have this cohort of college students from these two universities. We've been following them now. They just started their senior year. And we evaluate their Facebook profile on a monthly basis. And then we correlate the data that we see on Facebook with phone interviews with our ongoing participants. So to summarize observational studies, I think there's a lot of types of research questions. We can understand what I would call, for lack of a better term, maybe the epidemiology of displays for a particular behavior or for a particular site. You can understand the patterns of display over time, or patterns by location or by individual. You can understand the social context of these displays or the social response to the displays. And you can also understand public opinion or trends in sentiment. I think it's interesting that we've come a long way the last 5 to 7 years in social media where we have different methodologies to answer different questions. A lot of what I've shown you is a lot of what we do is content analysis, where we have coders who go through 2 to 6 months of training and extract that data manually, which to me is kind of analogous to a participant interview. You need someone highly trained, but you can really get at nuances. If there's something you're not clear on, you can follow it up. And I think big data offers a lot of exciting tools in looking at very large sets of data. And I think maybe there's some similarities to a cross-sectional survey where you can get a lot of data, but if someone doesn't answer your question right, you're not really sure whether that data is correct. And there's newer tools on getting at group data. Crowdsourcing can be similar to focus groups. So there's a lot of really exciting methodologies out there for observational work. If we transition now to thinking about association, so to me, association in my work means how does their online behavior relate to their offline behavior? And at the simplest level, what does a displayed reference mean to the profile owner who chooses to display it? And in this area, our work has mostly focused on alcohol, depression, and sex. And our study designs are usually fairly similar. We identify a health condition, we evaluate the profile using a code book, we categorize the participants as displayers of that condition or non-displayers. We ask our participants to complete a validated survey instrument that measures constructs of that condition, and then we compare displayers to non-displayers. In our early work, we looked at alcohol, and for our validated survey, we used the audit, the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, validated to detect problem alcohol use in college students. In this study, we categorize Facebook profiles as either non-displayers having no alcohol present, alcohol displayers having a reference to alcohol but not to problem drinking or to intoxication, and IPD as a reference to intoxication or problem drinking. And so as you can see, the median scores on the audit rise as you go through, as you are categorized into higher risk groups, with the only group that has a median score above the threshold of problem drinking being the IPD displayers. And in fact, when you look at how many of each group scored as at risk for problem drinking, almost 60% of those who had chosen to display references to intoxication or problem drinking on Facebook scored into that clinical criteria as at risk for problem drinking. When we did a similar study on depression, the validated instrument we used was the PHQ-9, which categorizes participants based on their score into no risk for depression, mild, moderate, or severe depression. And here in this graph, you can see that our non-displayers are the lighter bars and the depression displayers are the darker bars. And you can observe that for the mild, the moderate, and the severe categories of depression scores, the displayers are more common than the non-displayers. And the most statistically significant relationship is for those who scored into the mild depression category. Now, sex told us a little bit of a different story. In this study, we evaluated Facebook profiles from college freshmen. We categorized them as displayers of sexual content or non-displayers. We used criteria developed by the Kaiser Family Foundation that's been applied to television and movies. And then we gave them a survey examining sexual experience, oral, anal, vaginal, risky sexual behavior, number of partners, frequency of condom use, and sexual intention using the validated postponing sexual intercourse scale. And what we found was that display of sexual references on Facebook profiles was positively associated with reporting intention to have sex, but not sexual experience or risky sexual behavior. So for associations, again, the type of research questions I'm interested in is what does that displayed reference mean to the profile owner? And I put up here this old cartoon, which I've learned is one of the most downloaded cartoons of all time on the New Yorker. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And I love this cartoon because it fueled many of these studies, because early on, I had written a proposal to do one of these early studies, and a reviewer sent me back no text, but just sent me this cartoon. And so I think it really gets at how early on in the days of the internet and social media as well, we had this conception that the internet was a place you went to be someone else. You went there to be someone that you couldn't be in offline life. And I think what we've learned over time is that the internet and social media is often a representation of who you are. It's not everything of who you are, but it's a representation. And I love that this cartoon has been followed by this one that says, on Facebook, 273 people know I'm a dog, but the rest can only see my limited profile. And to me, when I think about associations, I think one of the most brilliant minds that has come to this question is Jane Brown, who proposed in 1995 something she called the media practice model. And her model argues that adolescents choose and interact with media based on who they are or who they want to be. And to me, that really gets at a lot of our work with associations, that adolescents who start to display references to alcohol, they may not be drinking yet, but they're letting people know that this is on their radar. They're letting this get integrated into the online identity they're revealing to others. And I think that should mean something to us when we're thinking about prevention and intervention. So now let's think about influence. We talked about what does the displayed reference mean to the profile owner? Well, what does it mean to their peers who see it? And I think it's important for us to couch this discussion in thinking about traditional influences on teens that we've known for decades. And two major influences on teens' choice of behaviors include peers and the media. And we have so much fantastic research showing that perception of peer use is among the strongest predictors of both substance use and initiation of sexual behavior. And in the world of media, there's been decades of traditional research on traditional media that have shown that seen representations of substance use or sex in media, such as television, movies, music, are also associated with initiation of these behaviors. So knowing this, I think it's interesting to ponder that what we have with social media is essentially peer-generated media. So when I was in high school, if I wanted to be like the coolest kid in school, I needed to sneak around and follow them and try to watch them and see what they did or how they dressed. But today, for today's teens, if they want to be like the coolest kid in school, they just need to Facebook stalk them, which is a lot easier and provides a lot more data to a lot more people. So can Facebook have a negative influence on teens? There's been a couple studies looking at alcohol. In an early study that we did, we found that teens felt that representations of alcohol on social media were both believable and influential, and their biggest worry was how it would influence the younger generation after them. In a study by our lovely colleague Dana Litt, she found that teens who viewed alcohol references on Facebook profiles reported an increased intention to want to drink. Now, how is social media influential? And one of the great thinkers in this area is Dana Boyd, who recently released a book that I'll quote, "It's Complicated." We did a study a couple years ago hoping to develop some sort of model or schematic to help us understand ways that adolescents themselves felt that social media influenced them. And with this hope of a lovely, small schematic, this is what we ended up with. So we used concept mapping, which is a really nice way to model complex behaviors. And what we found was concept mapping gives you a range of clusters. So these are our clusters, there's 13, and then these are example items. And in order to distill this down, we group these clusters into larger domains. So if we step back for a minute and think, what are the aspects of Facebook, as an example of social media, are influential? Under the larger domain of connection, we see clusters such as connection to people, allows people to constantly stay updated with each other's lives, keep in touch with people you wouldn't call or text. Far-reaching, you can reach many people on one website, you can reach anyone young or old, rich or poor, bonding across cultures and distances. Another aspect they felt was communication was the speed at which communication can happen. You feel connected and in the loop constantly. Business and promotion was felt to be something that was influential. The idea that you can plan influential events such as protests or sit-ins. Every company uses it to promote business or provide deals. The idea it's accessible and adaptable to provide data and information. And one of our participants said, this is the largest network in human history. It's easy to navigate. It's widely known and talked about. They talked about how you can have this shared language with someone. You can say, oh, I Facebook friended him, but then he defriended me. And people will know that language of what you're speaking. So that was the idea of connection being a source of influence. For identification, people talked about identity expression and the influence on your own developing identity. Examples include freedom to express things and let it be heard, the ability to present the best side of yourself, show off your accomplishments to everyone you're friends with on Facebook, not just your close friends. Influence on identity. You can provide others with pictures that can influence perceptions. You can display aspects of yourself you wouldn't share in offline life, such as sexuality and substance use. And you wonder if you should be doing what you see everyone doing in pictures. In the area of comparison, I think that this was another distinct area where we saw a lot of comments and a lot of influence being discussed by adolescents. And one area was being able to satisfy your curiosity about others. And they talked about you can know what people are up to without asking and without them knowing you know. Creep culture was a common discussion point. And you can see who associates with whom with pictures and comments. And then they discussed how Facebook is now a way to establish social norms. You can follow those norms. You can see what is popular by observation. And then I think another category we didn't expect was the idea of Facebook as an experience. They talked about it as an immersive experience, something you want to be a part of, something that you know provides these distractions, but it also provides positive and negative experiences. And so this really formed this complex map of how older adolescents viewed Facebook as having influence in their networked lives. So I think that influence is an area where there's a lot more research to be done. We've really only scratched the surface of it. And here I think thinking about how do we integrate new understanding of social media into our existing behavioral models? And then how do we capture aspects that are influential and then use them to promote healthy behaviors and sort of bump up against the tide of possible negative influential items that are on Facebook? And so then if we turn to interventions, I think this is a really exciting place to think about, and I think overall there's two broad things we can think about. One is integrating social media into existing successful interventions. You can increase your reach at a relatively low cost. You can add booster doses of a intervention that can be little social media nudges. And I think the other thing that we can think about is developing novel interventions that fully capture the power of social media, the power to be targeted, the power to give small nudges at low cost over time. And I suspect this will take integrating some knowledge from other fields that are already doing this, marketing, PR, communication. And so I think this is kind of risky business, but I think it's a compelling place for us to think about where to go. And as we start to think about ways we could develop social media interventions, I think a compelling thing to think about is to see what naturalistic interventions are already taking place. And that's where my group has spent a lot of our time over the last year, is trying to go out into the field and understand what people are doing with social media in a way that's very positive and pro-health. And one example is we conducted a panel of teen and young adult cancer survivors, and we interviewed them about the role of social media during their diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. And then the panel agreed to go and present publicly at a social media conference we ran this summer. There were a few themes that emerged from this discussion. Here's some of the representatives from our lovely panel of young women who are presenting at our SMART conference this past summer. So one of the themes that we heard about was information distribution, and I love this quote, so I'll read it. I was diagnosed with cancer on vacation. I went to Florida for spring break and ended up in the hospital being told I had a brain tumor. I had a suitcase full of bathing suits and no family around and was heading into a 14-hour surgery. I needed to get information out there fast so people would know what was happening and how to help. I used Facebook. So Facebook for information distribution in a time of crisis. Social connection was another theme. This participant said, I was in active treatment and in patient isolation for 28 days alone in a room. I used Facebook and Twitter to keep up with friends and family so that I didn't feel so isolated. Another common theme we heard was the adolescent or young adult at a children's hospital. This young lady says, I was diagnosed when I was 19, but I was sent to a children's hospital. I felt so alone there surrounded by little kids. I used social media to stay in touch with people my age. And one of my favorites was offering support and giving support in unlikely places. This participant said, I found other teen cancer patients on Twitter and got information for them. Now I use it to find newly diagnosed patients and help mentor them. So there's amazing things that are already happening out there that we can learn so much from when we think about what's possible. So what other potentials for intervention are possible? One is people identifying concerns based on social media posts. And I want to emphasize here again, I'm not talking about diagnosis, I'm talking about red flags that might prompt someone to seek appropriate clinical care or intervention. Maybe reaching out, offering resources. Who could do this? Well, parents are one of the fastest growing populations on Facebook. Dormitory resident advisors are already doing this on many college campuses. Peer leaders, trusted adults. I always love the cool aunt phenomenon. It seems like almost every teen has one cool aunt that's on Facebook and knows the skinny of what's going on. Teens are very open to this. We've studied it, but how this approach happens makes a huge difference. So in one study we discussed with older adolescent college students, and we found that they were open to being approached about displayed depression symptoms on Facebook, but they wanted that approach to be in person, and they wanted the person to come and focus their communication on asking questions rather than making judgments. In another study that we did, this is another vintage one, MySpace, we created an avatar called Dr. Meg, and we identified profiles that had a high level of risk behaviors displayed. Substance use and sexual behavior. And in half the group, we sent them a very carefully crafted message warning about the possibility of danger from displaying in that way. And we found that the intervention group participants were more likely to remove all sexual references compared to the control group. Another possibility for intervention is thinking about automated responses. So you post something and the site pops something back at you. And many of you know that this is already happening in certain programs. National Suicide Hotline is partnered with Facebook so that if you put in the word suicide, a pop-up for National Suicide Hotline will pop up. And I think that there's many upsides to these automated responses. It really gets at a population level. It's very low cost. It's built into a program. But some of the downsides are not all people post about suicide by calling it suicide or using the word suicide. And in most of our studies, older adolescents refer to this in many different ways without using the word suicide. But there's many conditions we could consider for an automated response approach: depression, anxiety, bullying, addiction. There's lots of possibilities there. And one thing that we've thought about is linking keywords to Facebook ads to pop up, which is actually an extremely inexpensive approach. Of course, we all know we're drowning in Facebook ads, so it's not likely to yield a huge immediate response, but it's cheap. I think another possibility for intervention is using it to stay connected with already established patients or clients groups. And we hear stories all the time about groups that are doing this. One story I really like is about a group of youth who attend an HIV a camp for patients who are HIV positive every summer, and they maintain a private Facebook group during the year in between the camps to provide each other support. A key piece of this is having an adult moderator within the group. And in the example I showed of the youth camp, they had an issue where one teen logged on and said, I've had it, I'm not taking any more of my meds, and I think none of you guys should either. And so they needed that adult moderator to jump in and diffuse that situation. So having adult moderators in these groups, remembering that these are adolescents, I think is an important piece. I think there's also a possibility for sharing health education. You can make it very targeted. You can deliver your message to people that post about a certain behavior or a certain condition. You can make it very timely, but it's really important to fit the culture of the site. And one great example of what I've been told is a failed experiment is a group that wanted to place some health information, and they put it into a men's hookup site. And what they found in their later testing was that men felt that this was not the appropriate culture of a site where they would be responsive to that type of education. So I think having some rudimentary knowledge of the site and what the culture is and what's okay to talk about is an important piece. So today we've talked through some key adolescent health issues. I've given you a glimpse at some key factors in the social media landscape. We've taken a whirlwind tour through 4 areas of research in which social media can be used: observation, association, influence, and intervention. A few of my take-home points would be that adolescent health issues really need to be prevented and addressed outside of the clinical setting, and adolescents are present and engaged on social media. So can we meet them where they are? And I think that social media does offer new opportunities for us to understand and observe individuals in that social context. Adolescents choose to display content that represents their views, their intentions, their behaviors on social media. And social media is influential. Much is to be learned about how to harness and fully understand this unique blend of influences. And I think many new opportunities for intervention exist. I'd like to thank NIH so much for the funding that we have received through the years for many of our projects. And I really also want to thank you for the training and the education that you've given me. I've been so honored over the years to attend workshops and seminars at several different institutes. And every time I leave a workshop or seminar, I always feel that I've gained so much more than I've given. And so I thank you for teaching me so much the past 7 years. I wouldn't be a social media researcher if I didn't put up a bevy of social media options for you to stay in touch. So whichever is your favorite poison, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, or our nice old-fashioned website where you can even submit questions or interact with us on the website. It's been a true pleasure to come and speak with you today. I would be open to answering any questions at this point. Thank you very much.
About 10 minutes for questions, and then if you'd like to join us in the library for reception afterwards, you can ask additional questions. But
hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I have a question. Okay, I noted there was a paucity of population-based studies. The only thing I saw that really referred specifically to any population, you said a college study between the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest. I'm wondering why you haven't tested and tried to pinpoint just on a U.S. map in terms of regionality, gender, socioeconomic level, or race, and put those variables in. I mean, that would seem to be the logical way to be looking at this. You're looking at a stampeding horde, essentially, just going through, and it's just very hard to follow unless you kind of pinpoint, gee, we're talking about this region, we're talking about this gender, more of the traditional epidemiological factors, so then you can look at interactions with different things. If you don't do that, what you're doing is hypothesis generating, which is nice, but it's also good to follow through, to have a null hypothesis and then try to prove it or disprove it. What I saw here was hypothesis generation, and I think the only way you're going to resolve that is by pinning down a population that you want to study, and then you can start working through more concrete conclusions or suggestions in terms of recommendations on using the Facebook. But I didn't see that was done here. Thank you.
If I understand your question, I think it's getting at that I didn't spend a lot of time in this talk illustrating the demographic makeup of every study we've done. I'd be more than happy to send you the papers that illustrate the demographic makeup, differences, similarities by race, by location, by gender, by age on these studies. It's certainly something that we capture as traditional data points, and I'd be more than happy to provide you more information on that.
And also in classic epidemiology, as I understand, bias is very important. And when you tell college students that you're watching them, that is, you have an informed consent for the study, I can't see how that wouldn't have some type of a strange influence. And if you would have to use something like a sham saying we're only going to really be monitoring 50% of you, you'd have to confuse them in that manner. That's definitely...
I think you have a really great point, and it's something that we've thought a lot about in the studies over time. I think some of our early studies, we would use what I would call backdoor methods, which is that we would find a population on Facebook or MySpace and then evaluate those profiles and then track down those participants. Now what we do a lot more is front door methods, where we recruit a participant population using very traditional methods to make sure our population is generalizable. We did some early work looking at how young adults would perceive having us among their Facebook friend count. And I think the point you raise is one that's a very common point to be raised, and something that I think about a lot. Our early studies suggested to us that for this generation of adolescents and young adults, there isn't that perception of being watched, because on Facebook, they may have between 300 and 1,300 friends. And so I think that there may be times where, or early in a study, they might think about us, but more often what we hear from them is we're just lost in a crowd of their perceived onlookers. It's something we always think about and always account for, that there is bias, but I think it helps us also understand that there's different perceptions of things like privacy among this generation that I can't say I fully understand. Okay, and furthermore,
what you did do is you've convinced me that Facebook and Twitter would probably be good investments as stock, because they're probably here to stay. Thank you.
Dr. Moreno, thank you very much. I'm going to try and write this up for, I'm a staff writer for our newsletter, and I was curious about one of your interventions in which you integrated social media into existing social interventions, and you said you added boosters or nudges. I was very interested if you could talk a little bit about that, please. And then you may have mentioned this, but do you define the ages of adolescents and where the cutoff is between that and young adult? Yeah.
Sure, that's a great question. Okay, I'll start with the age question. So the definition of adolescence varies by what organization you go to define adolescence, and it also is determined loosely by when you're in a hospital, what's an adolescent. In my clinical practice, adolescence goes somewhere from around 11 to 12 to around 23 to 24. A lot of times we use the definition of adolescence as 10 to 25, but there's a real emerging social trend of thinking about adolescents and young adults as a blending, where possibly this age range really represents somewhere between 10 and I've heard that young adulthood can go up to 39, so I just missed it. So I think it's a little bit of a moving target, but a lot of our studies, as you all can see, really focus on that transition out of high school and into college, because what I'm really interested in is that independence that adolescents are developing as they move away from home or they move to a new scholastic atmosphere, and they're gaining that independence.
And then the nudging, the boosters.
Oh, yes. So in that slide, I think what I was getting at is when I have collaborated and been asked to work on other projects and looking at projects that we've done, it seems as though intervention ideas broadly fall into those two categories. There's interventions that have a social media add-on, and then there's a possibility of interventions that really grow from social media as their roots. So what I was meaning for that is to broadly categorize kind of what we've seen in how people are talking about interventions.
So for example, could you give an example of a nudge? What would it be? What would a nudge be?
So receiving a tweet. So, for example, Alex Adams is doing a fantastic study, Healthy Children, Strong Families in the Native American population, and we partnered with her. Her study provides newsletters and fitness toys to give to families to promote physical activity, but now it also involves a Facebook group where adults can have a discussion once a month, and there's discussions on whether we'll add a Twitter component.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You bet.
Given the widespread adoption of Facebook and Twitter by parents and grandparents, what are the next platforms that you're hearing about that adolescents are using that you'll be doing future studies on?
That's a great question. One of the things that I feel really fortunate is that my research team always has representatives from college students as well as high school students, and I think they help us keep abreast of what's coming. What we hear about now, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook are the big ones, but it's also very interesting that within niche populations, there's niche favorites. Snapchat is big. I just can't see how long it will last, though. Tumblr, Reddit, but different kids go to Tumblr versus kids who go to Reddit. I think with the parent piece is very interesting, and my hypothesis would be that we would see adolescents and young adults start to flee Facebook the moment that Granny was online. But in our longitudinal study that I showed you last summer when we did interviews, we asked our college students who had just finished their sophomore year, how many of you have parents on Facebook? And it was 2/3 of them had parents on Facebook. Then we asked them, how many of you are Facebook friends with your parents? That was another 2/3. 2/3 of them are Facebook friends with their parents. Then we asked them, how many of you block content from your parents or employers? And it was only 20%. So something's going on where adults are coming onto these sites and teens are not fleeing in the numbers that we saw when people left MySpace. So whether that means Facebook will stay around, I don't know. It's definitely not cool anymore. And we definitely see media reports about teens moving away, but our numbers don't show those trends. It's a great question. Yes.
So you choose students from your study population, and then you interview them, right?
Within that longitudinal study, we have an ongoing participant population, yes.
So you randomly choose candidates. What if you see definitive red flags on their newsfeed or status updates? Do you still randomly choose the candidates, or you follow up with that candidate, or you reach their parents, or you just leave them?
So this is a participant population. We recruited the full population in 2011, and we followed them throughout college. And as I mentioned, they're just starting their 4th year of college. At the time we recruited them, we did not know what their Facebook profiles looked like. We recruited them, and then through the informed consent process, when that was complete, we Facebook friended them. We do have a protocol that if we see any disclosures that sound like suicide or extreme self-harm, that we have a protocol we put in place. Or disclosures that look like abuse or neglect, that we have a protocol for, but those are the only types of behaviors in this study that would trigger us to make some sort of intervention.
So do they still agree to participate in the study if you say, like, if you show signs like red flags, we are going to contact you or your parents or whatever?
We do not. These are participants who are over 18. There's no parents involved. So we don't contact them. This isn't an intervention study. If we see signs of red flags, we're not contacting them to offer an intervention. It's an observational study.
I have a question about informed consent. When you put something up on Facebook, you kind of release the need for informed consent. Where's the threshold that you need informed consent to do this kind of stuff?
In this study, we knew we were going to be tracking, in our longitudinal study, we knew we'd be following people over time. We knew that there would be an interview component, and so we'd have a lot of data about our participants over time. In that study, we actually have a certificate of confidentiality to protect that data. In terms of, so anytime we're recruiting a person or a participant and we're going to be viewing social media profiles, we always treat that as human subjects research, since the participant is really our unit. In some studies where, for example, maybe we're trying to get a sense of how often someone posts about drunk driving on Twitter, then the unit of analysis is actually really a tweet. And so what we've found is that IRBs generally will not consider those studies human subjects research because you're data mining from a large anonymous data set. But it's very nuanced, and different IRBs will view it differently, has been my experience.
Well, was all of the research you reported as informed consent?
Some of the public display, the Twitter study, for example, that was IRB declined review of that one. So the ones that are generally large public data sets and there's not a lot of demographic data, those are usually declined to be reviewed by our IRB. But anything that involves a participant we're interacting with and collecting self-report data is always an informed consent process.
Do you get the consent on the Facebook page?
No, we do it the old-fashioned way.
Okay.
I'm curious in how you incorporate the use of algorithms in terms of looking at peer influence, because one of the most interesting research parts I've looked at with influence is these silos that people get sucked into, where the things that are displayed on their Facebook newsfeed, for example, are articles that they've liked or friends that are influencing them, and it kind of increases the amount of influence. So how do you, because Facebook doesn't seem to publish their algorithms, so how do you kind of incorporate the use of algorithms into this research?
That's a really great question. I think that algorithms is something that's newer, and the refinement of their algorithms is relatively recent. As you know, now Facebook is allowed to tailor ads based on ways that you've interacted on other sites. That all of that is relatively recent, meaning in the last couple of years we've started to understand it. And so I think that's something that I'm not sure how we'll go about being able to bring that into what people are seeing. But we do hear a lot from our participants that they feel like the content is being more and more highly tailored to what they've posted and what they've looked at on other sites. So if you have a study idea for it, let me know.
So you mentioned how Facebook pops up with a national hotline number when someone posts about the suicide, but I feel like accounts such as Sexy Anorexia or other Facebook, Twitter, Instagram accounts that could promote violence, risky sexual behavior, alcohol use, could have a very harmful, effect on a population level. So, I guess where do you think is the boundary in monitoring these social media sites, as well as even the government, monitoring and intervening with those kind of accounts and posts?
I think you raise a really, really salient question, and I think one of the challenges in what your really elegant question is, we know that there's this harmful content out there, and how do we address it? Do we try to censor it? Do we try to better educate adolescents so they won't go to it? Do we defer search streams so that they aren't able to get to it? And one anecdote I would tell is we've been doing some studies on Instagram looking at self-harm. So Instagram had a hashtag called #self-harm, and it's all photos of people inflicting self-harm on themselves, mostly cutting. So I had heard about this in clinic among many of our patients who engage in cutting, that this is the cutting hashtag. So Instagram learned about it and they shut it down, because Instagram has in their terms of use that they will shut down any malicious content. My understanding was within roughly 24 hours, self-harm was back, but it had 2 M's. And then after a few months, Instagram caught on, they shut it down, now it's back. So the self-harm hashtag we're studying is self-harm with 3 M's. So I think one thing that's tricky is that teens are always sort of that step ahead of us in terms of figuring out a way around whatever barrier we put up. And so I think a lot more about media literacy, about sort of education with adolescents to try to reduce their need to be on these sites. On the flip side, there's also some fantastic pro-recovery sites out there. So if we can try to start to divert teens from the pro-harm to the pro-recovery, maybe there's something there. But I think your question has so much salience, and I apologize, I don't know the answer.
So thank you. I'm sorry we have to stop, but please come
Thank
meet
you all.
Dr.